It was the middle of the night, and the house was still, the air heavy with sleep. But suddenly, the peace was shattered by the loud, frantic screams of a parrot. It was 3 a.m., and the piercing sound seemed to echo through the quiet neighborhood. Inside the home, Clara and her husband, Ben, were jolted awake, their hearts racing from the shock. They exchanged confused glances before Clara hurriedly threw on a robe and rushed to the living room where the noise was coming from. Their beloved parrot, Max, was perched on his cage, wings flapping wildly, his eyes wide with panic. Clara could hear his voice breaking through the night, a string of unintelligible screeches, but there was an undeniable urgency in his tone. Ben followed Clara, still groggy, trying to figure out what could be causing the outburst. "Max, what's wrong?" Clara whispered, kneeling beside the cage. She gently reached out to calm him, but the bird only screamed louder, its feathers ruffled with distress. This was not the playful chirping they were used to, nor the occasional squawk for attention. This was something deeper. Clara's heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong, something beyond the usual antics of their mischievous pet. Max was more than just a bird to the family. He was a companion, a piece of their home for the last 6 years. They had adopted him from a local rescue after his previous owner had abandoned him. Max had been a nervous, cautious bird back then, but with patience and love, he blossomed into a vibrant, chatty member of the family. So when he screamed like this, desperate, frantic, Clara's motherly instincts kicked in. She moved closer, whispering soft words of comfort, but Max's screams only intensified, his eyes darting from side to side. It was as though he was trying to communicate something he couldn't fully express. Ben, equally puzzled and now fully awake, turned on the light in the room. They were both trying to piece together the strange behavior, but all they could do was stare at their frantic bird, feeling a growing sense of dread. This was not just a bird's cry for attention. Something had happened, something that neither Clara nor Ben could have expected. Their hearts raced as they wondered if they were about to uncover something far more emotional than they could ever have imagined. Max's frantic screams continued to fill the house, each cry more desperate than the last. Clara felt a chill run down her spine as she reached for the parrot's cage, her heart racing. "It's okay, Max," she murmured, her voice soft but trembling. Yet Max didn't seem to hear her. His body was trembling with fear, and his eyes were wide with something she hadn't seen before, a look of sheer panic, as if he was trying to escape something he couldn't shake. Ben stepped closer, his brow furrowed with worry. "What do you think's going on?" he asked, his voice quiet, as though he didn't want to disturb the fragile state Max was in. "I don't know," Clara replied, biting her lip. She noticed Max's feet were tightly gripped to the bars of his cage, his claws digging into the metal as if holding on for dear life. Something was off, something she couldn't put her finger on. Max had never been this agitated, not even during thunderstorms or when the vacuum cleaner roared to life. This was different. As if on cue, Max gave another loud shriek, and suddenly he staggered backward, his wings flapping erratically, knocking a few of the perches out of place. Clara instinctively reached out. But before she could stop him, Max darted toward the back of the cage, then froze. He looked as though he had seen something terrible. The screeching abruptly stopped. In its place, a haunting silence took over the room. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. Max's eyes were fixed on something beyond her, something in the shadows, something neither of them could see. Ben's hand went to his phone. "I'm calling the vet," he said urgently. Clara nodded, unable to tear her eyes away from the bird, whose distress had only deepened. What was going on? Was it just a random outburst, or was there something else at play? And why did it feel like Max was trying to tell them something? The tension in the room was unbearable, a palpable sense of unease hanging in the air. Clara reached for Max's beak, gently stroking him, but her touch felt futile in the face of whatever was happening. Something wasn't right, and the feeling of impending doom lingered. They were about to discover what it was. The next few days passed in a haze of confusion and fear. Max's once playful nature had been replaced by an eerie, near constant state of distress. Clara and Ben couldn't pinpoint what was causing the parrot's panic, but they both knew it was something more than just an off day. He had been acting strangely ever since that night, no longer greeting them with his usual chatter, no longer mimicking the songs they'd play on their speakers. Instead, Max remained perched in the corner of his cage, his head darting around as though searching for something. And those screams, always at night, always just before dawn. Ben had spent hours scouring the internet, trying to find a solution, but nothing seemed to explain what was happening. He even contacted a local avian behaviorist, who suggested that Max might be experiencing a form of post-traumatic stress disorder from something in his past. But that explanation didn't sit right with Clara. Max had come a long way since they first adopted him, thriving in their home and becoming a lively companion. He was comfortable here. They were sure of it. So why was he suddenly so afraid? Late one afternoon, Clara was sitting on the couch, flipping through a photo album with Ben, when they both heard it. The telltale screech of Max, but this time, it was different. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't desperate. It was softer, more pitiful. Clara's heart sank. She had heard that sound before. It was the same cry she had heard when they first brought him home. The cry of a lost soul, the cry of a bird in pain. Without hesitation, she jumped to her feet and rushed to the living room. Max was on the floor of his cage, lying still, his wings slightly spread as though he was trying to spread them, but lacked the strength. His eyes were closed now, his head resting against the bars. Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Max!" she called softly, her voice shaking. The parrot opened one eye, then the other, slowly. His body shifted, but his movements were sluggish. Clara's hand trembled as she reached in to lift him, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and concern. She cradled him gently, feeling his tiny body trembling in her hands. Max's feathers were ruffled and out of place. He seemed thinner than before, his usual vibrant plumage dull and lifeless. Clara could see the pain in his eyes. This wasn't just a behavioral problem. Something physical was wrong, something she couldn't fix with a few comforting words. She glanced at Ben, who had followed her into the room. His face was pale, his eyes wide with worry. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. They were both afraid of what this meant. They had no idea what could have caused Max's sudden decline. Without thinking, Clara called the emergency vet, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, we need help. Something's wrong with Max. Can you fit us in?" The vet assured her that they could take him in immediately. Clara didn't hesitate. She grabbed Max's carrier and placed him inside, trying her best not to hurt him, but his feeble cries broke her heart. At the clinic, the vet examined Max carefully, his expression growing more serious with each passing moment. Clara and Ben watched helplessly from the waiting room. They couldn't bear to leave his side, not when he needed them the most. But the longer they waited, the more anxious they became. They could hear the occasional sound of Max's soft cries drifting through the walls, and it felt like a knife in Clara's heart. When the vet finally emerged, his face was grave. "I'm afraid Max is suffering from a serious condition," he began, his voice calm but with a touch of sorrow. "It looks like he's been dealing with severe trauma for a while now, likely from an injury or some kind of attack. He's emotionally and physically drained. His immune system is weak, and he's been suffering from malnutrition. He's terrified, Clara. Ben, he's been so scared, so alone, and now it's affecting his health." Clara felt as if the ground beneath her had given way. Max wasn't just scared. He was broken inside and out. The realization hit her like a wave. His frantic screaming, his panicked behavior, had been his desperate attempt to tell them something he couldn't fully express. He had been suffering, and they hadn't even known, the vet continued, explaining that Max needed immediate care in a safe, peaceful environment to heal. Clara nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. The emotional toll on both of them was clear. What they had thought was a series of random behaviors had, in fact, been a silent cry for help. As Clara and Ben sat together in the waiting room, Their hearts heavy with guilt and sorrow, they vowed to do whatever it took to help Max heal. But first, they had to understand what had caused his suffering, and they knew it would be a long, painful journey. They couldn't fix him overnight, but they could start by showing him the one thing he needed most: unconditional love. The struggle was far from over, for Max and for them. They would have to work together, facing obstacles and setbacks, but Clara and Ben were determined to help their beloved Parrot recover, no matter how long it took. The battle to bring Max back to himself had only just begun. The days following Max's diagnosis were a blur of visits to the vet, medications, and attempts to comfort him. He wasn't getting better as quickly as they had hoped. His once bright eyes had dulled, his energy low. Clara spent hours sitting by his cage, talking to him softly, singing his favorite songs, trying to coax him back to the joyful Parrot he had once been. But no matter what she did, Max seemed unreachable, his body physically weakening and his spirit shattered. One evening, just as the sun began to set, Clara noticed something alarming. Max, who had always been so vocal, sat completely still in his cage, his eyes closed. His body was slumped, his wings drooping to the sides. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She had seen him tired before, but never like this. He looked defeated. "Ben, something's wrong," Clara whispered, rushing to Max's side. Ben was right behind her, his face pale as he saw their Parrot's state. "What's happening?" he asked urgently, his voice tight with fear. Clara gently reached in, hoping to get a response, but Max barely acknowledged her touch. He was cold. His breathing was shallow, slow, as if he were on the brink of slipping away. The vet had warned them that Max's condition could worsen, but seeing it unfold right before their eyes made it all too real. They had tried so hard, but they might not have done enough. Tears welled up in Clara's eyes as she stroked Max's head, her fingers trembling. "Come on, Max," she whispered, voice breaking. "Please don't leave us. We're here. We love you." Ben knelt beside her, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "He's a fighter, Clara. He's been through so much already. He can make it." But Clara wasn't so sure. The look in Max's eyes was haunting, too distant, too empty. She felt like they were losing him. What if they couldn't save him after all? It was then that the faintest flutter of wings broke through the silence. Max stirred slightly, lifting his head with what little strength he had left. His eyes locked onto Clara's. Only this time, there was something in them, a spark of recognition, a flicker of trust. Max opened his beak, letting out a quiet, weak chirp. It was so faint, but it was enough. A small, fragile sound that told Clara he was still there, still holding on. "Max!" Clara whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm here, baby. We're not giving up on you." At that moment, something shifted. Max may have been physically weak, but his spirit, the spirit that had made him so vibrant, so full of life, was still fighting. Clara and Ben both felt it, an invisible thread that connected them all. Max wasn't giving up. Not yet, but the situation was dire. Clara knew the next few hours would be critical. If Max didn't rally, if he didn't find the strength to fight, they might lose him forever. The vet had warned them that it could go either way, and they were right at that fragile edge. They had reached the most pivotal moment in this journey, the one where it all seemed like it could fall apart. The possibility that Max might never come back to them loomed large, and Clara's heart ached with the thought. This wasn't just about saving a bird. It was about saving the bond they had built with him, the love they shared. And that tense, fragile moment, Clara made a decision. She wouldn't let Max face this alone. She wouldn't give up. She whispered into his ear once more, her voice filled with unwavering resolve. "We're not letting go, Max. You're our family. We're going to get through this together." And with that, she gently scooped him up, her heart pounding as she held him close. The battle was far from over, but in that instant, they made a silent promise to each other. They wouldn't stop fighting for him, no matter what. Clara held Max close, her breath steadying as she gently rocked him in her arms. The house was quiet except for the soft sound of his breathing, which seemed to be growing steadier with every passing minute. She could feel his tiny heart beating, a steady rhythm that gave her hope. Ben, sitting beside her, watched anxiously, but his eyes softened when he noticed a slight improvement. "He's still with us," Ben whispered, his voice full of wonder. "He's really fighting, Clara." Clara nodded, her fingers still caressing Max's soft feathers. It had been hours since they first noticed his decline, and the change had been so subtle that she could hardly believe it. Max had always been a fighter, but now she could feel it more than ever. The fear that had gripped her heart seemed to be loosening, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. Max's head shifted slightly, and his eyes opened, though still weak. He looked up at Clara with a soft gaze, his small beak opening slightly as if he were trying to chirp. It was faint, but it was enough to send a wave of joy through Clara's chest. "Max," Clara whispered, tears of relief welling in her eyes. "You're coming back to us." Ben smiled, relief flooding through him as well. They both knew there was still a long road ahead, but in that moment, they allowed themselves to feel the weight of the victory. Max was going to be okay. The worst had passed. Max wasn't out of danger yet, but he was no longer slipping away. He had survived the worst of it, and so had they. Clara and Ben sat together, feeling the warmth of their bond with Max, knowing that this was the turning point. Together, they would heal. Together, they would make sure Max knew he was loved and safe. Days passed, and with each one, Max grew stronger. Clara and Ben never left his side, their bond with him deepening as they nursed him back to health. Max began to chirp more frequently, his voice growing louder and more vibrant with every passing day. His eyes sparkled again, no longer clouded with illness, but filled with the same joy and curiosity that had made him such a beloved part of their family. One morning, Max fluttered to his perch and sat there, looking around the room as if taking it all in. Clara watched from the kitchen, her heart swelling with emotion. She knew it wasn't just the physical healing that mattered. Max had healed emotionally, too. The joy he had once brought into their lives was slowly returning, and it felt like the family was whole again. Max was no longer the weak, sick parrot they had feared they would lose. He was back to his old self, full of life and mischief. He squawked cheerfully every morning, demanding attention and treats. Clara laughed, watching him tilt his head in that endearing way, as if asking, "Why aren't you giving me more attention?" Ben smiled and walked over to Max's cage. "You're not going anywhere, buddy," he said softly, reaching in to gently pet him. Max chirped in response, his little beak brushing against Ben's finger as if to say, "I'm here to stay." The relief and happiness in their home were palpable. Max was safe. He was back where he belonged, right beside the people who loved him unconditionally. As Clara watched Max hopping around, chirping happily, she thought about all the animals out there who didn't have a family to care for them. Max was lucky. He had been given a second chance, and she was determined to ensure that other animals had that same opportunity. "Adopt, don't shop," she whispered to herself, her heart full. There are so many animals out there who just need love. The story of Max was a reminder of the incredible bond we share with animals and how, with a little love, patience, and care, lives can be transformed. Let us remember that every pet deserves a family, and every animal deserves a chance to thrive. If you're considering bringing an animal into your life, think of the ones who need you most. Adopt a pet from your local shelter and give them the loving home they deserve.